I have spent my fair share of time in Israel, but I think this visit was one of the most unique. For a few days this summer, I tagged along with my husband, Greg, as he led 17 of his UBC students on an archaeological dig with Hebrew University at a site called Horvat Midras, about 20 kilometers southwest of Jerusalem. There was something so primal about digging in the dirt for hours every day, unearthing the layers of civilization that had come before. In Israel, it seems that if you put a shovel pretty much anywhere in the ground, the odds are you'll find something interesting. One day, I picked up what seemed like my 100th piece of pottery, and I went to toss it in the bucket of finds. But the shards stopped me. I could see as I dusted it off that there was something imprinted on the clay. There, hardened into the pottery, was a fingerprint of the ancient individual who made this vessel. It was like a personal greeting that bridged a 2,000-year gap between us. Who was this person? From then on, I saw that fingerprint on everything. For a few weeks, I held all of my encounters through this archaeological lens. Each object we hold is a product of someone else who came before us. If we stop to think about it, there are literal and metaphorical prints on everything. But when we walk around on our layer of civilization, it's hard for us to pay attention. There is so much that we ignore, laying just beneath the surface. If only we stopped to open our eyes and look. One of the 613 mitzvot of Torah is lo tuchal lehit'alem. You shall not ignore. Torah teaches us that we cannot ignore, be bystanders, or look the other way. If we see our neighbor's ox in the middle of the road, we have to bring it back. Once we see something, we can't pretend we didn't see it. Once unearthed, we can't put those observations back in the ground again. So today on Yom Kippur, I want us to think about this question. What do we ignore? Once our eyes are open in awareness, and we begin to see the fingerprints of others in the world around us, how does that change us? Might this awareness be an important step in our experience of tshuva? The decision to ignore happens many times a day. We ignore emails, phone calls, our nosy neighbor in the supermarket. Sometimes we actively ignore what's happening in the world, be it oceans away or on our street corner. Perhaps because we feel overwhelmed or maybe have empathy fatigue. But ignoring is not something that happens simply without our knowledge. Ignoring is an active effort. Sometimes we choose to ignore behavior around us that we know is wrong or in which someone is getting hurt because we're afraid to intervene, or because we assume somebody else will step in. Sometimes we are just plain tired, and that's okay when we need to take care of ourselves. But all of these choices have implications for us, for those around us, and for the world in which we live. A few weeks ago, during our Slichot program, we were fortunate to welcome Chief Robert Joseph and Robbie Weissman to our congregation. Both of these men are well known in our community. Chief Joseph for his work on behalf of Reconciliation Canada, and Robbie Weissman a beloved member of our local Jewish community, for his work as a Holocaust educator. The two guests were asked to participate in a conversation with Rabbi Dan about memory, trauma, and forgiveness. Robbie's experience as a survivor of Buchenwald is a familiar story for many of us in the Jewish community, the trauma of which has been a part of our collective consciousness since the terror-filled years of the Shoah. Witnessing Chief Joseph's testimony of the traumatic experiences of his youth in a residential school is a newer experience for us. It is the fingerprint that has long been upon the surface of our nation, yet many did not know it or chose not to look. But now we are aware. In recent years, we have learned so much more as Canadians and acknowledged the trauma that occurred and continues to have profound effects upon the Indigenous community. Teshuvah begins with awareness, but it is not an end to itself. I am very proud that Temple Sholom has created a working group to examine how we as a congregation and a Jewish community might do our part in reconciliation. While most Jews did not have a direct involvement in the residential schools, we are citizens of a country that has a collective responsibility to address and reconcile this wrongdoing. We cannot look away from what has been unearthed before our very eyes. Lo tuchal lehitalem. One must not ignore it. Around the globe, another fingerprint that has risen into our consciousness is the prevalence of sexual assault and harassment against women raised by the Me Too movement. What had been swept under the rug for generations has been brought into the spotlight. Part of the incredible power of the movement was the realization that this was an experience that most women, yes, our own friends, mothers, daughters, co-workers, myself, have experienced. For the past 11 months, we have encountered story after story as more have found their voice to be able to say that this happened to me, too. What had been kept quiet for far too long has now been met with willingness by many to raise the issue and a refusal to ignore it. Last March, our Temple Sholom Men's Club hosted a panel about the Me Too movement, specifically regarding sexual harassment in the workplace. I was very proud that the men who organized and participated in the evening were thinking about how to move beyond awareness into the realm of action. It is important that we as a community in the Jewish world and beyond continue to keep this issue in the forefront of our awareness so that expectations regarding what is acceptable and not will change for the better. The fingerprints have been brought into the light. Lo tuchal lehitalem. One must not ignore them. On Yom Kippur, we take collective responsibility for the actions that all of us have committed this past year. We pray in the plural for this very reason. Think about the Vidui prayer of confession that we just chanted together. Ashamnu, Bagadnu, Gazalnu. We did this, and we did that. Why do you think we recite it so many times on Yom Kippur? Because it's easy at the first or second read to think to myself, I didn't do that one. That wasn't me. But we are all responsible. And with each recitation, we open ourselves up to the awareness of what it means to be part of a collective process of tshuva. It's hard to take responsibility for something for which we had no personal involvement. I understand when people ask with true sincerity, I didn't harass any women. Why should I have to change my business practices? Or, my relatives were fleeing pogroms in Europe. Why should I apologize for residential schools? Engaging in a collective process of tshuva allows us to take responsibility, even when we were not the direct perpetrator. This, I think, is an insightful gift that our Jewish tradition can offer the world in the important work of tikkun and reconciliation. There are moments in our lives when we are confronted with a truth that we didn't ask for and didn't want to know about. But once we hear it or see it, we have no choice but to act upon what we have learned. The great sage Bob Dylan expressed this concept best in the 1960s when he asked the question, how many times can a man turn his head pretending he just doesn't see? Lo tuchal lehitalem, our Torah would answer him. Do not ignore what is in front of you. In our awoken state, we must respond to the truth of what we see. Looking into the mirror of your life, what is the truth of what you see? Are there truths staring you in the face that you are in the habit of ignoring? Surely there are things that all of us ignore about ourselves. We ignore health concerns, bullying and verbal abuse. We ignore our poor eating habits and difficult conversations we would rather avoid. But I would guess that the greatest personal challenge that many of us face are not the questions of what we ignore, but who we ignore. At playgrounds today, it is a common sight to see parents pushing their children on the swings with one hand while holding their smartphone in the other. A recent Pew Foundation study revealed that 89% of adults took out a phone during their most recent social interaction, and 82% said that doing so diminished the conversation. Most seriously, we are diminishing the conversations we have with our children. Sherry Turkle, an MIT professor who has written extensively on the stress that technology is putting on our relationships, shares the following anecdote. A father remembers giving his now 11-year-old daughter baths when she was a baby and toddler, talking to her, and he remembers this as a most fulfilling thing, something that deepened their bond. Now he and his wife have a 2-year-old, and he tells me that when he gives her a bath, he makes sure the water isn't too hot, and then he sits on the toilet seat beside her and does email on his phone. In study after study, children report that they must compete with technology for their parents' attention. Al chet shechatati. I do this far too often, and I am guessing that I am not alone in this sanctuary in that regard. There is always one more work email that needs responding, a notification that flashes and beckons me to click. We are all so concerned about our children's quantity of screen time and the damage that it does to their developing brains. But what about our screen time and the damage that it does to their developing souls? As Maimonides teaches in his Laws of Tshuva, I need to change my ways so that the same behavior doesn't repeat the next time I am faced with the same situation. I need to put my phone out of reach when we are together. I need to focus upon being truly present during the brief hours we have as a family each day. my eyes are opened? Will I allow the possibility of tshuva to change my behavior and change me? The author Jonathan Safran Foer puts a fine point on this message through a story he shared at a commencement address in 2013 at Middlebury College in Vermont. He had arrived a bit early to a breakfast with a friend in Brooklyn, so he sat outside on a park bench to wait. While waiting, he had the experience that most of us have had before. He saw a stranger crying in public. She looked to be university-aged, and she kept saying into the phone in her hand, I know, over and over. Then she said, Mama, I know. And she hung up the phone. At this point, Jonathan explains, he had a choice. He could either make her life his business, or he could respect the boundaries between them. He said he chose to approach. Instead of commenting on her crying, he commented on the weather. They had a brief back and forth, and then he said, Look, I don't mean to bother you, and you can tell me to mind my own business. But if there's anything I can do. And through a brief conversation, he learned that she was about to meet her birth mother for the first time. She wasn't actually even on the phone with anyone. She was just practicing what she might say to the mom who raised her. He pressed a bit further, sensing that she was making room for him. You kept saying, I know. What was that imagined response to? I imagined that my mom was telling me that she loves me. Then Jonathan told the Middlebury graduates and their families, that didn't happen. None of it did. I chose not to approach. He explained, it's harder to intervene than not, and vastly harder when we are scrolling through our phones or whatever your distraction happens to be. The phone didn't make me avoid the human connection, but it did make ignoring her easier and more likely. If this fictional story of an encounter between strangers gives us pause, then how much more so when it concerns our loved ones, who should be at the center of our attention. Our relationships with our loved ones are the most important in our lives, yet we can live isolated and disconnected from one another, even living in the same house. It's not simply a matter of smartphone etiquette. We must seriously consider how we can stop ignoring things that would in truth be helpful for us to see. There are some subjects we never want to discuss with those we love. Sometimes there is an old hurt we're afraid to broach, an emotional wound we fear reopening. If you take a moment to think about it, there are unspoken issues, I am sure, embedded within your relationships. Perhaps you have continued to ignore them because it is easier than addressing what underlies. On this Yom Kippur, we can aspire to be more, to connect more, to notice the divine light that connects all of us. These are the fingerprints. They are all around us, if only we would lift up our eyes to see them. Baruch atah Adonai, pokeach ivrim. Blessed are you, Adonai, who opens our eyes to see. Gemar Chatima Tova.